He forced me to split every bill 50-50, even when I was drowning. But the day I finally agreed to his rules, he realized he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. Stick with me while I share my story, and if it touches you, don't forget to support our channel by hitting that subscribe button, dropping a like, and sharing it with the people you care about. When I married Ethan, I truly believed we were building a life together. I worked long shifts as a nurse, often coming home exhausted, both physically and emotionally. Ethan worked as a corporate consultant. His job sounded stressful, but it came with a paycheck that was much larger than mine. Still, in the beginning, I didn't focus on numbers. I focused on love, partnership, and the idea that marriage meant supporting each other. A few months after our wedding, Ethan sat me down at the kitchen table. He spoke calmly, like he had rehearsed it. He said he believed in equality and modern marriages. According to him, the best way to avoid fights was to split everything exactly in half. Rent, utilities, groceries, vacations, dinners, everything would be 50-50. He smiled and said this would keep things fair. Something in my stomach felt tight, but I didn't argue. I told myself he had a point. I wanted to be a good partner. I wanted us to feel like a team. So I agreed, even though I knew my paycheck barely stretched as it was. At first, I tried to make it work. I skipped small comforts. I stopped buying new clothes. I picked up extra shifts whenever I could. When I came home tired and sore, Ethan would remind me that we both had responsibilities. If I mentioned how overwhelmed I felt, he would brush it off and say stress was part of adult life. Slowly, I started to notice things that didn't sit right with me. Ethan never worried about money the way I did. He bought expensive lunches, upgraded his phone, and talked about future trips like they were guaranteed. When I looked stressed over bills, he acted annoyed, as if my worry was a personal flaw. I was still cooking, cleaning, planning, and remembering everything for our household. None of that counted as effort in his eyes. To him, only money mattered, and only numbers on a spreadsheet showed fairness. One night, after a long shift where I barely had time to eat, I told him I was exhausted and scared I couldn't keep up. He didn't look up from his laptop. He just reminded me that we had an agreement and that backing out wouldn't be fair to him. That was the moment something quietly broke inside me. I realized this wasn't about equality at all. It was about rules that worked for him and silence from me. I didn't fight him. I didn't cry. I just nodded. And that was when I decided to truly follow his rules, exactly the way he wanted. After that, Ethan became stricter about money. What started as a simple agreement turned into a set of rigid rules. Every bill had to be split exactly in half. If the electricity bill came, he calculated my share down to the last dollar. Groceries were scanned, receipts saved, and totals divided. Even casual dinners turned into quiet math problems at the table. There was no room for discussion. If I tried to explain that one month was harder than another, Ethan shut it down. He said rules only worked if they were followed all the time. To him, changing anything meant weakness or unfairness. He liked the control, even if he never said it out loud. Some months were especially hard for me. Hospital shifts were cut, and overtime wasn't always available. My income dropped, but my share of the bills didn't. I paid anyway. I didn't want another argument. I didn't want to be told I was irresponsible or dramatic. So I made quiet sacrifices. I stopped going to the salon. I skipped doctor appointments I should have kept. I brought leftover food to work instead of buying meals. When emergencies came up, I used my savings, telling myself it was temporary. I told myself things would get better. At the same time, Ethan's life seemed to get easier. He talked about bonuses and raises like they were small details. He bought new clothes for work. He replaced his car earlier than planned. He never asked if I was okay with it. He never offered to cover more of the shared costs, even when it was clear he could. What hurt the most was not the money, but the silence. He stopped asking how my day went. When I came home tired, he was busy on his phone or laptop. If I mentioned being overwhelmed, he reminded me that stress was part of being an adult. According to him, emotions didn't change numbers. The house started to feel colder. We shared space, but not connection. Conversations became short and practical. I felt like a roommate, not a wife. I carried the weight quietly, hoping he would notice on his own. He didn't. I began to feel small and trapped. Every decision I made was tied to a calculation. I measured groceries by price, not need. I measured my energy by how much I had left after surviving another month. Ethan didn't see any of this. Or maybe he did and chose not to care. Resentment didn't arrive loudly. It built slowly, in moments of exhaustion and late-night worry. I loved him once, deeply. But with every receipt and every split bill, that love faded a little more. What remained was a growing distance and the quiet understanding that something was deeply wrong, and that I was paying the price for it alone. I found out by accident. One evening, Ethan asked me to check something on his laptop while he was in the shower. A message notification popped up on the screen. I wasn't trying to snoop, but the preview caught my eye. It mentioned lunch and money. My chest tightened. I opened the message thread, and everything became clear within seconds. Ethan had been paying for lunches, gas, and small expenses for a woman from his office named Lena Brooks. The messages were casual, almost friendly, but the pattern was obvious. He sent money without hesitation. No calculations. No rules. No reminders about fairness. My hand started shaking. I scrolled a little more and saw references to helping her out and don't worry about paying me back. These were words I had never heard from him when it came to me. When Ethan came out of the bathroom, I was still sitting there, quiet and stiff. I asked him calmly who Lena was. He froze for a second, then sighed like I had inconvenienced him. He didn't deny anything. He said she was a coworker going through a hard time. According to him, she needed support. I asked why he could support her but not his own wife. His answer hurt more than I expected. He said it was different. He said Lena didn't have anyone else. He said helping her didn't affect our agreement because it wasn't part of our household expenses. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I reminded him of the months I struggled, the times I hinted that I needed help. He waved it away and said I was stronger and more responsible. He said I could handle it. He said I agreed to the rules. That was the moment the truth hit me. The rules were never about equality. They were never about fairness. They were about control. He had no problem being generous when it made him feel good or important. He just didn't want to do it for me. The betrayal wasn't only about money. It was about realizing that my pain had never mattered to him. He watched me struggle and chose to do nothing. Worse, he used my sense of commitment against me, knowing I would keep paying and keep quiet. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I listened while he explained himself and justified his choices. Every word pushed me further away from him. I saw him clearly for the first time, not as a partner, but as someone who benefited from my silence. That night, I lay awake next to him, staring at the ceiling. I felt foolish for all the times I defended him in my own head. I felt angry, but more than that, I felt resolved. Something inside me hardened. I understood then that I had been following rules designed to keep me small. And I also understood something else, very clearly. If he could bend his principles so easily for someone else, then those principles were never real. I didn't confront him again. I didn't argue or demand apologies. I stayed quiet. But this time, my silence wasn't weakness. It was the beginning of clarity, and the end of believing his version of fairness. That weekend, Ethan invited my family over for dinner. I thought it would be a normal gathering, but it quickly turned into a nightmare. As soon as we sat down, he started criticizing me in front of everyone. He said I was careless with money, that I didn't plan properly, and that I was a burden on him financially. My parents looked uncomfortable, but Ethan didn't stop. He smiled as if he thought it was funny. After the initial shock, he handed me a piece of paper. It was a formal expense agreement he had drafted. He wanted me to sign it immediately. Every bill, every subscription, every minor cost was listed with my exact share. There was no room for discussion. He said this would make our life transparent and fair. My family tried to speak up for me, but he waved them off, insisting it was a modern solution and I just needed to cooperate. I felt trapped. Humiliated. Angry, but I didn't say a word. My throat felt tight, and my hands shook, but I stayed quiet. I smiled politely, nodded, and signed the paper without protest. Inside, though, something shifted. I realized that arguing, begging, or trying to explain myself would never work. He had built a world where my feelings didn't matter, and every attempt to fight back only gave him more control. That night, after everyone left, I sat in the kitchen alone. I replayed every argument, every payment, every time I had tried to speak up. I realized that my energy had been wasted on trying to make him see fairness or empathy. None of it mattered to him. Instead of continuing to fight, I made a decision. I would follow his rules, exactly. Every bill, every expense, every calculation. No exceptions. No excuses. No emotions. I wouldn't argue, I wouldn't complain, and I wouldn't cry over it. I would observe quietly and let him show himself through his actions. By letting go of trying to change him, I found a strange sense of power. I could see clearly how his mind worked, where his priorities lay, and how his control shaped our life. He had built a cage for me, but by agreeing to his rules in full, I became the one who understood the boundaries. I knew how to navigate them, and more importantly, I could prepare for what I needed to do next. Humiliation no longer scared me. Instead, it became a tool. Every insult, every criticism, every mocking remark he made at that dinner became a reminder of the truth. I wasn't weak. I had been forced into a position where I could finally see the reality of our marriage. And now, I was ready to act, not out of emotion, but with strategy. That night, I went to bed feeling a quiet determination. I would play by his rules, but I would also plan my escape. Ethan thought he had complete control. Little did he know, by humiliating me, he had only shown me the path to turning his rules against him. I started quietly preparing for myself. I opened a separate bank account, one Ethan didn't know about, and began saving every spare dollar. I cut out unnecessary expenses, no more fancy coffees, no more impulse buys, nothing that wasn't essential. Every payment I made to him or the household was recorded carefully. I wanted a clear picture of where I stood financially. At the same time, I stopped doing the extra work that had always gone unnoticed. I stopped reminding him about bills, stopped cleaning up after him, and stopped covering for his forgetfulness. I didn't volunteer for errands or make excuses when he was late. I stopped cushioning his life so that his mistakes or forgetfulness didn't affect him. At first, Ethan didn't notice immediately. But soon, he began to grow irritated. He asked why the kitchen wasn't spotless, why the laundry wasn't done on time, why bills weren't double-checked for him. He accused me of being cold, distant, and uncaring. I didn't respond with anger or explanations. I stayed calm. I simply followed the rules he had set, did my part, and nothing more. I also started consulting a financial advisor, quietly, without telling him. I wanted to know exactly what I needed to be independent, how to manage my income, and what steps I could take to protect myself. Every conversation with the advisor gave me more clarity and confidence. I realized that I could live on my own, fully prepared, without depending on him for anything. The change in our home was noticeable. Ethan's irritation grew every day, and he tried small manipulations, complaints, guilt trips, and passive-aggressive comments, but none of it worked. I didn't argue, didn't beg, didn't explain myself. I just let him live in his frustration while I quietly built my safety net. I started keeping a detailed record of every transaction, every bill, and every payment I made to the household. I also documented times he refused to adjust his rules or recognize my struggles. This wasn't revenge yet. It was preparation. I knew that someday, if I needed to, I could show exactly what had happened and protect myself completely. By taking these steps, I felt a sense of control that I hadn't had in months. My mind was clearer, my emotions steadier. I wasn't reacting to Ethan's actions anymore, I was observing them and planning my next move. I realized I could survive, and even thrive, without his approval, without his help, and without his recognition. For the first time, I felt like I was acting for me, not for him. Every small step, every dollar saved, every boundary I set, every piece of documentation, was a step toward independence. Ethan may have believed he controlled everything with his rules and his authority, but quietly, I was building a life he couldn't touch. And that realization gave me a strange, quiet satisfaction. One morning, Ethan came home looking frustrated and tense. His company had announced unexpected layoffs, and his bonus, which he had been counting on, was gone. He immediately started talking about our bills, our mortgage, and our savings. He looked at me with that same expectation I had grown used to, expecting me to step in, to cover for him, to make things easier while he recovered. I listened quietly. I could see the worry in his eyes, but I didn't feel panic. Instead, I remembered all the months I had struggled quietly under his rules, all the times I had covered more than my share, and all the sacrifices I had made. For the first time, I felt completely ready to say no. When he asked if I could lend him money, I didn't hesitate. I spoke calmly, my voice steady. I reminded him of the 50-50 rule he had forced on me for so long. I told him there would be no exceptions, no favors, no bending the rules. If he wanted support, it had to be mutual, equal, fair. I didn't soften my words, and I didn't apologize for them. He froze. His mouth opened and closed a few times, but no words came out. I could see the shock in his eyes. He had never imagined that the rules he created could ever be used against him. Suddenly, the power he had held for months flipped. He realized that the control he had over me was fragile, based entirely on my willingness to follow his demands without question. He tried to argue, to justify why this situation was different, why I should help him anyway. I didn't respond. I simply repeated the rule, 50-50, exactly as he had insisted for every bill, every expense, every decision. I didn't add emotion. I didn't beg. I didn't explain myself further. For the first time, I watched him struggle. He couldn't manipulate me with guilt or shame. He couldn't threaten me with words or anger. He had created the rules, and now those same rules were holding him accountable. The balance had shifted. I felt calm and clear, while he floundered. That evening, he sat silently at the kitchen table, staring at the bills and his empty plans. I went about my usual routine, keeping up my own contributions and my own boundaries. I realized that for the first time, I wasn't a helper, a fixer, or a caregiver. I was an equal, a partner on my own terms. In that moment, the house felt different. The fear and exhaustion I had carried for months began to lift. I understood that power doesn't come from money alone, and control doesn't last when it relies on someone else's compliance. Ethan had built a world where he thought he could demand loyalty and sacrifice at his convenience. But now, the rules he trusted to dominate me had become the very thing that kept him in check. And as I watched him struggle to adjust, I felt a quiet satisfaction. I hadn't yelled, I hadn't fought, I hadn't begged. I had simply waited, planned, and acted when the time was right. The turning point had come, and I was finally free from being trapped in his world. After that turning point, things changed quickly. Bills started piling up on Ethan's side. Rent, utilities, and all the lifestyle costs he once enjoyed without worry suddenly became his responsibility alone. The vacations, the dinners out, the little luxuries he always flaunted, now they felt heavy, expensive, and impossible to manage without extra help. He came to me one evening, clearly frustrated and desperate. He asked if I could lend him money to cover part of the rent and a few overdue bills. I looked at him calmly and reminded him of our agreement. I told him I would not give him loans. I would only maintain equal responsibility, just as he had insisted for months when it came to me. At first, he didn't understand. He argued, his voice rising, trying to guilt me into helping him. He said it was temporary, that he needed support, that I should be there for him as his wife. I stayed quiet, letting him speak. I repeated my words once more, 50-50, no exceptions. His anger grew. He accused me of being selfish, cold, and heartless. He reminded me of all the times he had supported others or made decisions without consulting me. He said I had changed, that I was no longer the partner he married. But as I watched him, I realized something I had never fully understood before: he had never truly empathized with me. The nights I stayed up worrying about bills, the exhaustion I carried from long shifts, the sacrifices I made quietly, he had never acknowledged them. He had never treated my struggles as real or important. Now, the situation was reversed. He was feeling the pressure, and suddenly he could understand what it meant to carry the weight alone. But instead of compassion or humility, he became angry and desperate. He expected me to step in and rescue him, just as I had always done. But I didn't. I only followed the rules he had set for us. Every request he made, every argument, only reminded me how unfair everything had been. He had assumed his income, his comfort, and his control were permanent. He had assumed I would always absorb the stress and cover the gaps. And now that he was struggling, he realized he had built no safety net for himself. I stayed calm and collected. I didn't insult him, I didn't lecture him, and I didn't mock him. I simply maintained the boundaries that had been missing in our marriage. I realized that the consequences he faced were a result of his own choices, his own control, and his own refusal to see my perspective. As the days passed, the imbalance became clearer. I was not helping him beyond fairness, and for the first time, he felt real pressure. It was uncomfortable for him, but it was the same reality I had lived under for months. And in that discomfort, I finally understood how much I had endured, and how little he had ever truly cared. A few weeks later, I discovered something that changed everything. While reviewing some old emails and receipts for my own records, I found clear proof that Ethan had planned to leave me once he was financially stable again. The emails were casual, almost careless, but the meaning was unmistakable. He had been discussing starting fresh with Lena Brooks, making plans for a life that didn't include me. I felt a rush of clarity rather than heartbreak. All the small betrayals, the arguments, the humiliation, the control, it all made sense now. He had never intended to treat me as a true partner. Everything he had demanded, every rule he had forced on me, had been part of a plan to keep me in place until he was ready to move on. Instead of panicking, I stayed calm. I went through all the records I had been keeping, every bill, every payment, every moment he had refused to help when I struggled. I had documentation of his actions and his words. For the first time, I felt prepared. I realized I didn't need to confront him with anger or tears. I had the clarity and the evidence to act quietly and deliberately. I decided to file for separation. I did it calmly, without a scene or a fight. I wanted to protect myself, not to humiliate him. I knew that I could handle the financial and emotional realities of living alone because I had prepared for months. I had built a safety net, saved money, and documented everything. I had turned his rules into my protection. When I finally handed over the separation papers, Ethan was stunned. His face changed from frustration to disbelief, and I could see he hadn't expected this. For the first time, he realized that the control he had thought he held over me had no power anymore. I wasn't reacting emotionally, I was acting with calm determination, and that shook him. As I packed a few of my things to move into my own space, I felt a strange sense of relief. I wasn't angry in a destructive way, I wasn't seeking revenge yet. I was simply reclaiming my life. All the months of struggle, silence, and careful planning had led to this moment of empowerment. It became clear to me that the betrayal had been his, but the strength was mine. I wasn't hurt because I had been blindsided, I was ready because I had seen it coming. His plan to leave me had failed not because of luck, but because I had quietly prepared for it every step of the way. For the first time in years, I felt truly free. The marriage that had once felt like a cage was now behind me. I had the clarity, the evidence, and the confidence to start my life on my own terms. Ethan had built a world that he thought trapped me, but in the end, it had only prepared me to walk away stronger, wiser, and fully independent. The day of mediation arrived, and Ethan walked in expecting the usual. He expected me to be emotional, to beg, to plead, or to let him manipulate the situation. He thought I would cry, argue, or give in to his pressure like I had so many times before. But I didn't. I was calm, collected, and fully prepared. I laid out everything clearly. I showed documented finances, every bill I had paid, every extra contribution I had made, every instance where I had covered more than my fair share. I had proof of all his luxuries, the times he had ignored my struggles, and the moments when he had treated the 50-50 rule as a weapon rather than a partnership. I presented everything logically, without raising my voice or showing anger. There were no dramatic speeches, no emotional outbursts, just facts. I made it impossible for him to argue. He realized quickly that his leverage, his assumed control and authority, was gone. I wasn't pliable, and I wasn't intimidated. Ethan tried to interrupt, to explain, to convince the mediator that he had been fair. I didn't respond. I kept my statements simple, precise, and backed by evidence. Every claim I had made was supported by records he couldn't dispute. What shocked him most was that I didn't need to humiliate him or expose him publicly. I didn't attack his character, I didn't gossip, and I didn't lash out. I simply refused to save him anymore. I refused to give him anything beyond what was fair. I refused to cover his mistakes or make excuses for him. The restraint itself became my revenge. Ethan, who had thrived on control and compliance, was left powerless. All the months he had spent trying to dominate me were meaningless now. He couldn't manipulate the situation, and he couldn't guilt me into bending my boundaries. Sitting across from him, I felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. I realized that revenge didn't need shouting, insults, or public exposure. It could be calm, methodical, and complete. By simply protecting myself and refusing to step in, I let him experience the consequences of his choices without me stepping in to soften the blow. The mediator nodded, acknowledging the fairness of my presentation. Ethan's frustration grew as he realized he had no ground to stand on. I could see it in his face, his control had slipped, and it wasn't coming back. By the time the mediation ended, I felt lighter than I had in years. I hadn't screamed, I hadn't yelled, and I hadn't begged for fairness. I had achieved what I wanted with clarity and calm. The power he thought he had over me had vanished. And in that quiet, controlled way, I finally understood that revenge wasn't about hurting him publicly. It was about reclaiming my life, protecting my boundaries, and refusing to let him dictate my future. The satisfaction was in my calm, my preparation, and my ability to walk away from him with dignity intact. After the mediation, I moved into my own space. It was quiet, peaceful, and completely my own. For the first time in years, I felt emotionally lighter. I had control over my life, my time, and my money. I could make decisions without fear or guilt, and the weight I had carried for so long finally began to lift. Ethan, on the other hand, was struggling. Not because I had ruined him, but because he had built our marriage on selfish rules and control. He had assumed I would always absorb the stress, cover the bills, and keep the household running perfectly, no matter how much it cost me emotionally or financially. Now, faced with reality, he was forced to manage his life without the support he had always expected. Living on my own gave me time to reflect. I thought about all the years of following his rules, all the sacrifices I had made, and all the times I had ignored my own needs to make him comfortable. I realized that true partnership isn't about splitting bills evenly or keeping score. True partnership is about sharing burdens fairly, noticing each other's struggles, and helping one another when life gets hard. I also understood something important about strength. I hadn't won by yelling, humiliating him, or trying to punish him. I had won by staying calm, following his rules exactly, and preparing quietly for my own independence. My strategy had allowed his own behavior to expose him, and in doing so, it revealed the truth about our marriage without me needing to attack him personally. Being on my own also taught me self-reliance and confidence. I could handle finances, responsibilities, and daily challenges without relying on anyone else. Every decision I made was for me, not for him. And with that independence came peace, a peace I had never felt while living under his control. Sometimes I think about Ethan and what he lost. He had the chance to build a fair, loving partnership with me, but he chose control and selfishness instead. His choices reflected his priorities, and now he had to live with the consequences. It wasn't my job to teach him a lesson, life did that on its own. I am happier now than I have been in years. I sleep without worry, make plans without fear, and enjoy my own accomplishments without needing validation. I learned that dignity and patience can be stronger than anger and revenge. By standing firm and keeping my boundaries, I protected myself and allowed the truth to reveal itself naturally. In the end, I walked away not just free, but wiser. I learned that fairness isn't calculated with numbers or spreadsheets, it's measured by respect, care, and shared responsibility. And for the first time in a long time, I felt the satisfaction of living life on my own terms, completely in control of my own future.